The emergency klaxons were still wailing when Ambassador Glorbnik burst through the doors of the Galactic Council chambers aboard the luxury station Pretentious Spiral. His 6 insectoid legs clicked frantically against the polished floor as he waved all 4 of his arms in what could only be described as the universal gesture for "we are so screwed." "Fellow beings of the Council," Glorbnik announced, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for announcing either intergalactic war or really bad cafeteria food, "we have a situation of the most dire proportions." Admiral Tentacula, whose species had evolved from what humans might generously call angry squids, immediately slammed 3 of her tentacles on the conference table. "Is it the Zephyrian Rebellion? The Quantum Pirates? The mysterious disappearance of my favorite tactical mug?" "Worse," Glorbnik wheezed, pulling up a holographic display that flickered with the kind of technical difficulties that only happen during genuine emergencies. "We have discovered evidence of Earth's most terrifying weapon." In the corner, Counselor Fluffbottom, who looked exactly like what would happen if you crossed a rabbit with an anxiety disorder, immediately began stress munching on a purple carrot from his big emergency snack stash. "Oh no, oh no, oh no. I knew we should have just left them alone with their weird coffee obsession." The hologram finally stabilized, showing what appeared to be a standard Earth information broadcast. The title read, "Nature's Ultimate Survivor, The Honey Badger Chronicles." "Behold," Glorbnik announced with the dramatic flair of someone who had clearly missed his calling as a space opera narrator, "the apex hunter." Admiral Tentacula's tactical tentacles immediately began forming complex knots, a sure sign of impending military strategizing. "Show me the weapon specifications, armor ratings, combat protocols." "That's just it," Glorbnik continued, his mandibles clicking with barely contained terror. "This creature appears to have no weapons except its natural biological capabilities. Yet according to this documentation, it can defeat creatures 10 times its size, survive venomous attacks that would kill most sentient species, and most horrifyingly, it does not appear to experience fear." Fluffbottom's munching intensified. "A fearless biological weapon. The humans have bred a fearless biological weapon. The documentation calls it nature's most badass creature," Glorbnik read from his notes, somehow making the word badass sound like a death sentence. "Colleagues, I submit to you that the humans have not only weaponized their planet's fauna, but they have created propaganda to celebrate these instruments of destruction." The hologram showed a honey badger casually ripping apart a beehive while completely ignoring the angry swarm around it. Several council members gasped. One actually fainted. "Look at its tactical approach," Admiral Tentacula observed, her voice filled with professional admiration and absolute terror. "Complete disregard for enemy numbers. Focused objective achievement. Zero retreat protocols. This is the work of a military genius." "And they call it an educational program," Glorbnik added ominously. "They are training their young in the ways of the apex hunter." Fluffbottom had moved on to his second carrot. "We need to quarantine Earth immediately. Maybe evacuate this entire sector of the galaxy. Do we have time to relocate to another dimension?" "I've already placed our defense fleet on high alert," Admiral Tentacula announced. "If these apex hunters are standard Earth fauna, we need to reassess everything we know about human military capabilities. What if they have breeding programs? What if they have entire armies of these creatures?" The chamber erupted into panic, chittering, bubbling, and the occasional dramatic gasp. Emergency protocols were activated. Defense grids powered up. Someone started drafting a strongly worded letter to the Galactic Insurance Company about updating their Earth-related incidents policy. And that's exactly when Jake Morrison walked in, carrying a travel mug of coffee and wondering why everyone looked like they'd seen a ghost. Jake Morrison had been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, not that she was counting or anything. She'd gotten the job primarily because she was the only human who didn't burst into laughter when the aliens first made contact. Her 30 years as head lunch lady at Millbrook Elementary had prepared her for dealing with dramatic overreactions to perfectly reasonable situations. "Morning, folks," Jake said, settling into her designated human chair, which the aliens had thoughtfully made exactly 3 sizes too small, because apparently nobody had bothered to check human seating requirements. "Hope I'm not late for our trade meeting about the coffee imports." Traffic was murder coming through the Andromeda bypass. The silence that greeted her was the kind of silence usually reserved for moments right before someone announces the apocalypse. Glorbnik finally managed, his translator struggling with what sounded like a voice crack. Ambassador Morrison. We need to discuss Earth's military capabilities. Jake took a sip of her coffee, the good stuff from Earth, not the alien swill that tasted like disappointment and regret. Military capabilities? What about them? We agreed to keep our weapons development transparent in the trade accords. The Apex Hunter project, Admiral Tentacula stated, all her tentacles now arranged in what Jake had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of pointing guns. We need a full briefing on deployment capabilities, breeding programs, and containment protocols. Jake blinked. Then she blinked again. I'm sorry, the what now? Fluffbottom's carrot crunching reached panic levels. Please don't play innocent, Ambassador. We've seen the documentation, the promotional materials for your biological warfare program. Look, Jake said, using the same tone she'd perfected for explaining to 8-year-olds why they couldn't have chocolate milk for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding here. What exactly are you talking about? Glorbnik activated the hologram again, and Jake found herself staring at what was very clearly a nature documentary. Specifically, a nature documentary about honey badgers. The narrator was enthusiastically explaining how honey badgers were basically the ultimate don't care animals of the African savanna. Jake stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds before the pieces clicked into place. Then she did something that sent the entire council into immediate defensive positions. She laughed. Not a polite diplomatic chuckle. Not a nervous giggle. A full, honest-to-goodness belly laugh that echoed off the chamber walls and probably violated several galactic peace treaties. Oh my God, Jake wheezed, wiping tears from her eyes. You think honey badgers are weapons? The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 20 degrees. Every alien present was now staring at her with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright terror. You find this amusing? Admiral Tentacula's voice had taken on the kind of dangerous quiet that usually preceded someone getting their tentacles in a twist. These creatures are clearly engineered for maximum combat efficiency. Engineered? Jake was still grinning. Folks, honey badgers are just animals. Regular old Earth animals. They evolved naturally, just like everything else on our planet. Glorbnik's mandibles clicked rapidly. You expect us to believe that evolution randomly produced a creature with such devastating tactical capabilities? Well, Jake said, settling back in her too small chair, when you put it like that, you should probably see our wildlife documentaries about Australian spiders, or Canadian geese, or literally anything that lives in Florida. The silence returned, but this time it carried a distinctly ominous undertone. There are more? Fluffbottom whispered, his carrot forgotten mid-crunch. Jake was beginning to realize that this conversation was heading somewhere she probably should have seen coming, but given that she'd spent 3 years learning that aliens had a remarkable talent for misunderstanding perfectly normal human things. Oh boy, she muttered into her coffee. This is going to be a long meeting. What happened next was what Jake would later describe to her sister as the most expensive game of telephone in galactic history. Because apparently when you tell a room full of panicked aliens that there are more creatures like honey badgers on Earth, they don't interpret that as nature is neat and diverse. They interpret it as Earth is basically a planet-sized weapons development facility. Emergency protocols are now in effect, Admiral Tentacula announced, her tentacles working furiously at what Jake assumed was some kind of military keyboard. I'm calling in additional council members for crisis consultation. Crisis? Jake tried to interject, but Glorbnik was already activating holographic communication arrays. Within minutes, the chamber filled with the shimmering forms of alien dignitaries from across the galaxy, each materializing with expressions of barely contained panic. Jake recognized a few of them from previous trade meetings, but most were new faces, or face-adjacent anatomical features. High Inquisitor Jello Brain, reporting from the Gelatin Nebula, announced a wobbly translucent being whose entire body seemed to be having an anxiety attack. Is it true that Earth harbors multiple apex hunter species? War Chief Stabby McStabface, checking in from the Crystal Gardens, added what appeared to be a living chandelier. Despite his intimidating name, Jake had learned that Stabby was actually a pacifist who grew prize-winning space roses and made excellent tea cookies. Ambassador Morrison, Glorbnik said, turning to Jake with the kind of grave seriousness usually reserved for funeral directors. Please provide tactical assessments of these additional apex hunter variants. Jake looked around the room at 24 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, all waiting with bated breath or whatever they used instead of breath for her response. Well, she said slowly, there are geese. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Jello Brain's form began vibrating at frequencies that shouldn't have been possible. Stabby McStabface's crystalline structure actually changed color. Fluffbottom dropped his carrot entirely. Geese, Admiral Tentacula repeated, her tactical brain clearly trying to process this new threat. Aquatic assault units? They honk, Jake added helpfully. Psychological warfare, Glorbnik whispered in horror. Sound-based intimidation tactics. And they chase people, Jake continued, beginning to enjoy herself in a way that probably wasn't diplomatically appropriate. Pursuit predators, Admiral Tentacula confirmed grimly. Sustained harassment protocols. Sometimes they steal food right out of your hands. Resource acquisition raids. Jake was starting to understand why her predecessor had quit after 6 months. They're just birds, guys, cranky birds. Just birds? High Inquisitor Jello Brain's form was now oscillating between purple and green. Ambassador, your casual dismissal of these biological terror units only confirms their effectiveness. What other just animals has Earth deployed? Jake glanced at her coffee mug, which had a picture of her nephew's golden retriever on it. She looked back at the assembled alien leadership, their faces full of expectant dread. Well, she said, there are also dogs. The emergency klaxons that had been quietly humming in the background suddenly escalated to full volume. Dogs? War Chief Stabby McStabface somehow managed to sound terrified despite being made of crystal. What are their combat specifications? They have teeth, Jake said innocently. Biological weapons integration, Admiral Tentacula noted grimly. And they're really good at tracking scents. Advanced surveillance capabilities. Also, they're extremely loyal to humans. Programmed psychological bonding with handler units. Jake took another sip of her coffee and wondered if this was how wars started. By the time Jake realized she was in too deep to back out gracefully, the Galactic Council had already mobilized 3 defense fleets and started drafting evacuation procedures for the local star cluster. So she did what any reasonable former lunch lady would do when faced with a room full of hysterical aliens. She decided to lean into the chaos. You know what? Jake said, pulling out her phone with the kind of theatrical flair she'd learned from watching kids perform in school plays. Maybe it would be easier if I just showed you some tactical footage. The room went dead silent except for the gentle humming of life support systems and Fluffbottom's nervous digestive processes. Tactical footage? Glorbnik leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting the phone's screen like a dozen tiny disco balls. From Earth's military installations? Oh, absolutely, Jake said, scrolling through her photo gallery. Here we have some footage of human youth combat training. She turned the phone toward the assembled council and hit play on a video of her nephew's soccer game from last weekend. As you can see, Jake narrated in her best nature documentary voice, young human warriors engage in coordinated group maneuvers, demonstrating pack hunting strategies and territorial control. On screen, a bunch of 10-year-olds ran around a field chasing a ball while parents shouted encouragement from folding chairs. Note the aggressive pursuit tactics, Jake continued, and the way they coordinate to overwhelm their targets. Admiral Tentacula's tentacles were taking notes. Actual notes. Remarkable. They begin military training at the juvenile stage. What's the significance of the spherical object? That, Jake said solemnly, represents a strategic objective. Whichever unit controls the sphere demonstrates dominance over the battlefield. Brilliant, War Chief Stabby breathed, his crystalline form sparkling with what Jake hoped was admiration and not impending violence. Simple, effective, and it teaches resource control. Jake swiped to the next video. And here we have advanced chemical warfare techniques. The screen now showed her watching a cooking show where some cheerful chef was making what appeared to be a souffle. Observe the precise measurement of chemical compounds, Jake explained, getting into the spirit of things. The careful application of heat for maximum effectiveness. The timing required for optimal deployment. They're teaching these techniques publicly? High Inquisitor Jello Brain had turned a shade of green that probably wasn't healthy. This level of operational security is either incredibly confident or completely insane. Both, Jake said honestly. Definitely both. She swiped again. And finally, our surveillance and infiltration specialists. The video showed Mrs. Patterson's cat, Mr. Whiskers, doing that thing cats do where they stare at absolutely nothing for 20 minutes, and then suddenly sprint across the room like their tail is on fire. Notice the stealth capabilities, Jake said, really warming to her theme now. The ability to remain motionless for extended periods. The sudden burst of speed when action is required, and most importantly. Mr. Whiskers chose that moment to knock a plant off a windowsill for no apparent reason. The psychological impact of random, unpredictable actions on enemy morale. Dear Cosmic Forces, Counselor Fluffbottom whispered, reaching for another carrot with trembling paws. They've weaponized chaos itself. But wait, Jake said, scrolling further, there's more. The Council collectively held whatever they used for breath as Jake queued up another video. Human pack bonding demonstrations, she announced, showing them a compilation of people hugging their dogs. They form emotional attachments with their biological weapons. Glorbnik's voice cracked again. The psychological warfare implications are staggering. It gets worse, Jake said, pulling up a video of someone teaching their parrot to say hello. Advanced communication integration with aerial reconnaissance units. By this point, several council members were openly weeping, which looked different depending on their species but universally sounded like someone slowly deflating a balloon. Admiral Tentacula finally stood up, all her tentacles quivering with what Jake realized was probably existential dread. Ambassador Morrison, I need you to be completely honest with us. How many of these biological warfare programs does Earth currently operate? Jake looked at her phone's photo gallery, which contained approximately 3,000 pictures of various pets, family members, and random animals she'd found cute. Well, she said thoughtfully, let me check my records. Jake Morrison had reached what her grandmother would have called the end of her rope, and what her nephew would have called peak Aunt Jake energy. She'd spent 45 minutes watching the galaxy's most advanced civilizations work themselves into a collective panic attack over a nature documentary and some home videos, and frankly, she'd had enough. All right, everybody just stop, Jake said, using the voice that had once made an entire cafeteria of sugar-high third graders sit down and pay attention. Turn off the alarms. Put away the tactical manuals. Somebody get Fluffbottom a glass of water before he chokes on that carrot. The authority in her voice was apparently universal, because even beings from completely different evolutionary trees immediately stopped what they were doing. Now, Jake continued, let me tell you about the real apex hunter. His name is Tommy Henderson, he's 8 years old, and he carried a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles lunchbox to school every day last year. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could actually hear the station's air recycling systems. I don't understand, Glorbnik said carefully, as if speaking to someone who might be having a complete mental breakdown. Tommy's dad, Mike Henderson, makes nature documentaries for a living, Jake explained patiently. He drives a 2019 Honda Odyssey with Cheerio crumbs permanently embedded in the back seats. The Honey Badger documentary you're all freaking out about? He filmed it last summer during his family vacation in South Africa. His wife spent the entire trip telling him to stop getting so close to the animals. But, Admiral Tentacula started, the tactical capabilities are just what honey badgers do, Jake interrupted. They're tough little animals. Nature made them that way. not some secret government lab. Mike thought they were cool, so he made a documentary. That's literally it. War Chief Stabby's crystalline form was slowly shifting from alarm red back to his normal rose color. You're saying this apex hunter is simply naturally occurring wildlife? Yep. Yeah. And before you ask, geese are just birds that happen to be jerks. Dogs are pets that we keep around because they're good company and occasionally useful. And cats are basically tiny roommates who judge our life choices. Jake stood up, walked over to the refreshment station, and poured herself more coffee from the pot she'd brought from Earth because alien coffee tasted like regret mixed with cleaning fluid. You want to know the truth about my qualifications for this job? She said, stirring in some real sugar. I used to pack lunches for 400 kids every day. I had to know which kids were allergic to what, who wouldn't eat anything green, and how to make a peanut butter sandwich that could survive being thrown around in a backpack for 6 hours. She turned back to face the council, all of whom were staring at her like she'd just announced she was actually 3 raccoons in a trench coat. Tommy Henderson was one of my kids. Every Tuesday, he'd trade his apple slices for extra cookies. Every Thursday, he'd forget his lunch money and I'd have to call his dad at work. Mike would show up in paint-stained jeans because he'd been editing footage in his garage, which he converted into a studio because real documentary filmmakers can't afford fancy offices. But the promotional materials, High Inquisitor Jello Brain bubbled weekly, the celebration of destructive capabilities. That's called education, Jake said. Mike makes documentaries because he thinks animals are amazing and wants other people to appreciate them too. The honey badger thing isn't propaganda for biological weapons. It's just some dad being enthusiastic about wildlife. She pulled up another video on her phone, this time showing Mike Henderson himself, a slightly balding man in a safari hat that was clearly purchased at a tourist shop, narrating footage while his wife told him in the background to please stop trying to pet the elephants. This, Jake said, is your terrifying military mastermind. The collective sound of 24 alien civilizations simultaneously realizing they'd just mobilized their entire defense apparatus over a suburban dad's hobby was something that would probably become legendary in galactic diplomatic circles. So, Jake continued cheerfully, now that we've established that Earth isn't planning to conquer the galaxy with weaponized honey badgers, can we please get back to discussing coffee import quotas? The aftermath of what would later be known as the Great Honey Badger Incident involved a lot of embarrassed alien coughing, or the equivalent thereof, and some very awkward attempts to power down defense systems without anyone noticing. So Glorbnik said eventually, his mandibles clicking in what Jake had learned was the insectoid equivalent of clearing your throat, if these creatures aren't weapons. Why do you document them so extensively? Jake settled back into her inadequate chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd just watched a room full of adults realize they'd been afraid of their own shadows. Because they're interesting, she said simply. Humans like learning about stuff. We make documentaries about everything. Animals, space, cooking, people who collect vintage bottle caps, you name it. If it exists, somebody has probably made a documentary about it. But why? Admiral Tentacula asked, her tactical brain clearly struggling to process information that didn't fit into neat military categories. What strategic advantage does this provide? None, Jake said, and watched several council members look genuinely confused by this concept. We just think the universe is pretty cool and we like sharing that with each other. War Chief Stabby's crystalline form was now sparkling with what Jake recognized as curiosity rather than alarm. You create detailed observational records for no tactical purpose? Look, Stabby, Jake said, using the nickname that always made the crystal being light up like a Christmas tree. Let me put this in perspective. Last week, Mike Henderson probably spent 6 hours editing footage of meerkats standing around looking cute. Not because meerkats are going to take over the world, but because he thought people would enjoy watching them. Meerkats? Fluffbottom squeaked, reaching for what appeared to be his emergency carrot stash. Tiny mammals that live in groups and take turns watching for predators, Jake explained. They're about as threatening as a sneeze. You have documentary evidence of organized surveillance networks? High Inquisitor Jello brain was oscillating between colors again. I have documentary evidence that small animals are adorable, and Mike Henderson has too much time on his hands. Jake pulled out her phone again, this time showing them her lock screen a picture of her holding her nephew Tommy, who was grinning and missing 2 front teeth. This is Tommy Henderson. Age 8, current favorite food, mac and cheese with hot dogs. Future career ambitions, astronaut, dinosaur hunter, or professional ice cream taster. His biggest accomplishment this year was memorizing all the words to that song about the wheels on the bus. She swiped to another photo. And this is Mike Henderson, Tommy's dad, holding the camera he used to film the honey badger footage. He bought it with money he saved by bringing bag lunches to work for 6 months. His biggest concern in life is whether Tommy's getting enough vegetables and if his wife will let him buy a new telephoto lens for Christmas. The aliens stared at the photos with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for studying military intelligence. "You're saying," Glorbnik said slowly, "that your species creates detailed observational studies of potentially dangerous fauna purely for entertainment and education?" "And because we think nature is awesome," Jake added. Mike Henderson spent 2 weeks in South Africa getting footage of honey badgers, not because he wanted to develop them into weapons, but because he wanted to show people how incredible they are. "Incredible," War Chief Stabby repeated thoughtfully. "Not terrifying?" "Well, I mean, they're pretty terrifying if you're a snake or a bee," Jake admitted. "But they're also just doing their thing, living their lives, being honey badgers." Mike thought that was worth documenting. Admiral Tentacula's tentacles had finally stopped forming tactical knots. So humans observe and record other species simply because you find them fascinating. "Pretty much," Jake said. "We're kind of obsessed with learning about stuff. Plants, animals, space, each other, whatever. If it exists, some human somewhere probably wants to understand it better and share what they learned." She took another sip of coffee and watched as 24 advanced alien civilizations slowly came to terms with the fact that humanity's superpower wasn't military might or advanced technology. It was curiosity. And honestly, Jake thought to herself, that was probably way more dangerous than honey badgers anyway. But she decided not to mention that part. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out something that made every alien in the room immediately tense up again. "Speaking of human capabilities," she said with a grin, "anyone want to see my old hairnet from the school cafeteria?" The resulting panic lasted another 20 minutes, but at least this time Jake got her coffee import quotas approved while everyone was distracted. Some days she really loved her job.